Good morning, everybody, once again to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. We are delighted that you are here and look forward to another excellent conversation with Gary Chartier. We had planned for him to be with us once a month, but my circumstances were such that in September, I benefited from him being here often. So with today, we get back onto our normal schedule. We begin with Romans chapter 13. And this is what Gary calls the Pauline principle throughout his book. I noticed from a footnote that actually there were people before him, well back into the 19th century, who were using this expression, the Pauline principle, though they may have given it somewhat different meanings along the way, and that most recently, Alan Donegan at the California State Institute of Technology in Pasadena, a man who taught Christian ethics there in that Institute of Technology, used in his book, A Theory of Morality. So here is the Pauline principle, at least one of the passages for it. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So that's one of the passages. The other one is in Galatians chapter 5. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love, become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. So we begin with prayer. Dear God, again, we begin with thanks. Thanks for these ancient texts that can mean so much for us today. Thanks for each other. Thanks for the technology that brings us together from all parts of the world, now and later on Facebook and later on YouTube. And thank you for Dr. Chartier, who has blessed us so often with his scholarship and will do so again today. In Christ's name, amen. Well, again, thank you to everybody, and thank you to Gary. Welcome back, Gary.
Good morning, Dave, and good morning to everybody else.
Okay, I have here some questions about your chapter 2, which is entitled A Creational Love Ethic, which is in your book, The Task of the Moral Life, the most recent book published by Fortress Press this past month, September. It occurred to me that since they're publishing a second book by you, they must have been well pleased with how the first one went.
Well, I suppose Ryan Hemmer, who was my personal editor there and who's now taking over as editor-in-chief, might be better able to comment than I, but I'm very grateful for their support. Yes,
now it's a Lutheran press, correct?
Fortress, yeah, as the name might suggest, has a traditional Lutheran association, and indeed it's published. The corporate entity, I think, that owns Fortress Press is 1517 Media, clearly intended to evoke the,
surely you jest.
No, I'm not at all.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Wow, that's keeping the tradition going. Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm going to move through your chapter almost in reverse order, if that's okay, because I would like to end up with your specifications on love and spend our most time there. So I'll deal with some things along the way, and hopefully we can get down that way pretty swiftly. But I would like to begin by referring to the last 2 pages of your book, in which I find these words.
Of the book or the chapter?
I'm sorry, the chapter. So this is in the section called Creation, Love, and Truth. You talk about how people grow in their understanding of how widely they should respect each other, not just their own tribe, but other tribes as well. And you write, this kind of historical development doesn't involve change in any what is true about what it means to live a life of love. Rather, it involves a change in our awareness of what is true, in our knowledge of the creation, and of the meaning of love. Then further down in this, on the same page, you write, there really is a world that is independent of us, independent of our biases and prejudices and background assumptions. Then later on that same page, you say, even though the deep character of love is constant, there can sometimes be changes in what we ought to do. Next page. It is important to see that the underlying truths about love remain the same. In this case, for a creature like that, flourishing will necessarily look like this. Then another comment. Something it would be wrong to do in a given situation will always be wrong in a relevantly similar situation. Then, here we go. You call this position robustly realist, and then you say, or precedingly, you say, the truth doesn't change, but our knowledge of it does, and so does the relevance of particular truths to our conditions. So my question is, how does your understanding of truth, as I have just read it, compare to the old idea of present truth that many of us are familiar with?
So I think the idea of present truth, the idea that God enables us to, nudges us to learn more, to continue to discover, and that some of the truths we discover are particularly relevant in particular circumstances, that seems very helpful indeed. What I'm trying to do, of course, in this segment of the chapter is to take a fairly strong stand against varieties of historical and sociological relativism that assume that what's true, and certainly especially what's true in this case in moral matters, is somehow dependent on our attitudes or our beliefs or something like that. And so rather what I want to suggest is that indeed, if what's true in these moral matters is a function of the way the world is, the way God has made that world, then that's going to be a constant. But at the same time, obviously, it's not confident moral realism. It's just pigheadedness to assume that we understand the world perfectly and that we understand moral reality perfectly. That point about present truth is absolutely crucial, that we need to keep growing in our understanding. And we obviously need to be thinking carefully about how given considerations are relevant in a particular case. So I'm trying to walk a fine line here, unequivocally rejecting, subjectivism and sociological relativism and so forth on the one hand, while on the other hand, also avoiding what I think is a temptation that I notice, not on the part, I think, of serious thinkers so much as on the part of pundits, making noise in the public sphere, that somehow you must be embracing relativism or something like that if you disagree with me. And that can't be right either.
Do you expect any pushback on this from those who are really emphasize the social construction of reality and perspectivalism and things like that.
Well, I guess there are different folks in that, of whom we might speak there. So I think that, if we're talking about people who are really kind of full on, subjectivists, or again, for want of a better term, I'll say sociological relativists, then obviously those are people who are presumably not going to be very enthusiastic about an exercise in Christian theology in the first place. On the other hand, if you're thinking about people in the Christian tradition who emphasize our social embeddedness, if you think about people like Alistair McIntyre and Stanley Hauerwas, undoubtedly they would have various things to disagree with me about here. But I mean, I take them not to be saying at all that ultimately what is the case is relative or subjective in any deep sense. I think they're interested in the way in which our historical circumstances open us up to the discernment of particular moral truths. I mean, I think McIntyre is a thoroughgoing moral realist, for instance, but I think he also supposes that to both identify moral truths and to validate them is to engage in a kind of ongoing kind of process of historical sort of contestation. So that's a different matter, but it doesn't involve any kind of questioning of the underlying idea that what we're talking about is the way that what matters is the way God has made the world.
Okay, maybe I can turn to a second issue right now, and that is many discussions of love, many Christian discussions of love in particular, make much of the word agape. And that word has virtually no role to play in your book. I think the only place I see it mentioned is where you speak about it with some reservations. I don't know if it has any other place in the book. Haven't read the whole book yet, but that's my impression yet. Haven't reread the whole book yet, I should say. Why not make use of this word agape?
Well, so I think that the short answer is that, as I understand it, and as I try to suggest, I think in this chapter, the problem is not that we can and that we shouldn't find something of value in reflecting on the word agape, but that well, to take a step back, I would say that in much of the 20th century, we witnessed an attempt to do what we might call theology by etymology. And, there was a tendency, especially, really, I think, but with regard to both Old and New Testament theology, to do this. There were these massive works, the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, that were supposed to provide detailed theological analyses of how all sorts of relevant words got used. And once we had undertaken the task of thinking that through, we would know what we needed to know about all sorts of things. And I think there are two problems there. One, that probably word studies on their own are not going to solve a lot of theological problems. Words get used in sentences and in contexts, and we need to think more broadly about them. The other is that I think discussions of agape in particular just went down a mistaken path in this period. And, agape was read in a way that certainly people who were adept in classical Greek didn't recognize. And so the claim often was, well, it's specifically a certain kind of usage in the Septuagint that's then sort of appropriated by the New Testament, and it's how the New Testament's using this language from the Septuagint that really matters. And so what I do here, it's we can talk a bit more about how I think the word got misused. I guess probably worth being clear about that. A lot of people, I don't know. I remember growing up hearing, when I was very young, hearing a sermon that made a great deal out of the distinction between agape and eros. Didn't refer much to philia or epithemia, but or storge, but the the idea that became very common in a certain subset of Protestant circles was the idea that agape is first and foremost a word about God's love for us, and that is an utterly unmotivated and bordering on, I think, the arbitrary kind of love that is really kind of synonymous with unmerited grace. And for people who took this seriously, it then became common. There wouldn't be, I suppose, a necessary entailment, but it was common then for people to try to develop approaches to Christian ethics, which used agape in the same way with respect to human love, asking, I think, often of people a kind of entirely detached and almost impartial love. It wasn't thoroughly impartial because certainly you find, especially in the early Paul Ramsey, but I think this was an expression of what you'd find elsewhere, and there's a chapter on this later. It wasn't completely impartial because it didn't view the self impartially. The self was supposed to be thrown out entirely. So it was impartial with respect to everyone other than the self. This sort of notion, I think, was pathological, but I don't think it had anything to do with what was going on in the Septuagint or then later in the New Testament. I can't immediately document this, and there might be linguistically capable people here who would challenge the claim. But the observation I know. There's a cognate, for instance. Well, here's the way to put it. Agape gets used in the Septuagint far more capaciously in its various forms, certainly if you think about its cognates, than you'd ever imagine from reading the work of people who think that we ought to embrace a so-called agapistic Christian ethic. And so what I do in this chapter really is to draw on the work of James Barr, who does a very detailed analysis of this matter, and just shows that the attempt to kind of tease out a special meaning for agape really is not sustainable. And so I think that's, I'm not a linguist, and so it's sort of obviously possible that I can be off base here, but I would just say my sense is that classicists don't recognize the special usage, and people who've done kind of serious work in New Testament Greek, certainly a linguistically adept person like Barr, would say it's not there in the Septuagint or in the New Testament as well, that there's just a much broader range of meanings than people like Anders Nygren, who famously popularized this imagined rigid distinction between agape and eros, seem to want to suggest.
Now, it seemed interesting to me that you noted that Jesus spoke in Aramaic in all likelihood, and that these distinctions are Koine Greek ones, and therefore the meanings may not carry over as precisely as some think. Do you want to comment on that?
I do. So I think that complicates things even further, that the attempt to kind of extract a New Testament theology from Koine Greek, where this is concerned, seems doubly troubling, because we'd have to figure out what's likely going on, even ignoring all the questions about historicity, interpretation, and so forth. If we're trying to get back to the sayings of the historical Jesus, it seems to me, to try to base anything on the choice of this term is especially problematic. Yeah, I mean, the Septuagint authors apparently, in rendering, Greek versions of the biblical text, tried to consistently render the same Greek word, or the same Hebrew word or the same Greek word. But of course, we have no idea, for instance, whether the same kind of thing was true with regard to people in the early church taking collections of sayings of Jesus that had circulated and rendering them into Greek. I mean, I'm not sure we have any way of knowing, what rules they might have followed in regard to translation. So, yeah, I think we're left uncertain there, and it just seems foolish to try to base a whole kind of doctrinal edifice on that.
So what am I supposed to do with a sermon that makes the whole sermon is based on the difference between agape, philia, eros, and epithemia or storge? What do I do with that sermon? Throw it away?
Well, yeah, I think that's what you do, because certainly of course there are different things going on there, but there's overlap, and there's far more kind of complexity, it seems to me, far more semantic drift in these terms. And if the sermon just is an attempt to kind of talk about all the different things that are going on in the New Testament when these words are used, no, don't throw that out. But if what you're trying to do is to develop a theology or an ethics based on word studies there, then yeah, I would say that's a sermon that perhaps belongs on the shelf.
But we could still have places called Agape House, meals called Agape.
Sure. Oh, sure, because we know the early Christians, the early Christians, I take it, used this language of the agape, but it doesn't follow that because they had they used this word for love as a word for the kind of welcoming meals that they experienced, that on its own is enough to allow us to develop a kind of elaborate theory.
So it turns out it's one of the words for love in the New Testament, but shouldn't be so deeply divided between the others. Okay. I see that Professor Alexander wants to get in on this. And do you want to say something about this now or later? Later? Okay, we'll wait till the discussion period. Now, from here, I'm going to try to get back to the beginning of the chapter and try to move through it in a more systematic way. And if we recall, in the last chapter, you defined love as appropriate regard for the well-being of the beloved. And you use words like flourishing as an equivalent to well-being. And then we need to say that the word beloved gets quite expanded so that it involves eventually all sentient creatures. So we might say love is appropriate regard for all sentient creatures. That means we regard each sentient creature in the way that it should be regarded, given who it is. Okay, and if we want to know what we mean by regard, we can ask ourselves, what do we mean by disregard? And that would help us get the picture going. Now, that leaves us at the end of chapter 1. As we move into chapter 2, we're asking the question, well, what do we mean by well-being? What do we mean by flourishing? So if love is appropriate regard for the well-being or flourishing of a sentient creature, we have to have a pretty good idea of what that is. And this is the place where you introduce the notion of a basic good. What is a basic good?
Yeah. So, you find the language of basic goods or basic, I often refer refer to basic aspects of well-being, basic aspects of flourishing. So what we're talking about here are, generic categories of well-being. And, we're thinking about, in other words, the important idea here, it seems to me, is that a lot of the time when we seek to contribute to well-being in one way or another, we're not fostering, or we may be fostering, we're not directly affecting basic goods. So, if I contribute to your fame, let's say, or your financial well-being, these things may, in one way or another, have implications, positive implications for your ground level well-being, but they're, as it were, instrumental goods, right? I mean, it's, we normally, at least, we think of somebody who, let's say, thinks of, acquiring money as an end in itself, as kind of bordering on the pathological. Money enables us to participate in a variety of aspects of well-being, but it's itself a kind of instrumental good. It's a means to those. So the basic goods, by contrast, don't need to be explained with reference to, understood with reference to any more fundamental kind of well-being. Rather, they just are the kind of bedrock of our well-being. That's what I have in mind when I use that language of basic goods.
I'm sorry. Now you move into a portion of the chapter that I found exceedingly helpful, because it builds upon a question I had previously asked, not only me, but others, and that is, how do we know what the basic goods are? And I can remember pressing you pretty hard on that issue several years ago. And in this chapter, you have given us 5 ways that we can know what a basic good is. And I find that exceedingly helpful, and to my way of thinking. Now, what I would like to do is summarize in my own words these 5 ways and ask you if I've gotten it right. I think I may be close on the 4th one, on 1 through 4. I think I'm really in trouble on the 5th one, but I'll give it an honest try and let's see what you think. Okay, here are the 5. We can tell when a sentient creature is flourishing, and we can ask what things or goods are minimally required to make its flourishing possible. Or contrarily, B, secondly, on the other hand, we can see that a sentient creature is not flourishing, but languishing. And then we can ask what it lacks or what it minimally would be required to enable it to flourish. Third, we can ask ourselves and others why we are doing what we are doing. For each answer, we can ask another why, and then still another why, until we have finally reached a place where we can answer that question no longer. And at that ending point, why? And when we say, well, it's just because, at that point, we have reached a basic good. D, I think, is pretty straightforward. We can study flourishing societies and why they are flourishing, and presumably we could study languishing societies and why they are languishing. I think I'm pretty close on those 4. The 5th one I'm in big trouble with, but I'll give it an honest try. We can discern the various potentials a sentient creature has and asks what it would be required to at least to realize what would be required to release at least. Let me try it again. We can discern the various potentials a sentient creature has and ask what would be required to really realize at least some of them. So what do you think? How close did I come?
Yeah, no, I think that's nice. So let's just kind of walk through those maybe a little more elaborately, and you can dive in at any point here. So, we do that. First of all, I think this kind of the most simple and straightforward point is that we do this often enough, when we're thinking about people, but also when we're thinking about other kinds of creatures, both sentient and non-sentient. Can look at a tree and say the tree seems to be flourishing. I can look at a dog and say the dog seems to be flourishing. We examine, it just, seems to be the case when we look at experiences that we and others have, and we can think about, as I say, think about a judgment that things are going well for somebody in a given case. When you make that judgment, when you think about, I think, so and so's life is going well, and then you might just ask yourself, well, how is so and so's life going well? Just what it is in virtue of which things are going well, and and you can kind of do engage in what we sometimes call thick description, really just trying to get all the features of the situation out on the table, and think about, what are we really talking about when we say things are going well here. And so I think that's often the most helpful thing, is to really put ourselves imaginatively in a situation. We ask what's going to count as flourishing. And also, of course, we might just do it more abstractly. We might just think about, well, what would lead us to say that somebody was flourishing here as a matter of imagination. Now, it's going to be important in this case to recognize that all of these, and so this in particular, probably need to be viewed in relation to each other, and we need to ask about a kind of a coherent package, and kind of whether everything we're talking about can be said consistently, and whether there are objections we might want to consider. So I'm not saying when I talk about using any of these approaches that the approach is somehow going to give us an infallible path to answering the question, when are things going well for somebody? I'm just talking about the different approaches we might take that I think we might draw on cumulatively. It is really important, as I've already noted, to say, to ask ourselves, are we really talking about something that's a basic aspect of well-being, or is it something that is a means to the end of fulfillment, right? So to take an obvious example, we might instinctively judge that somebody was doing well because she inherited a large sum of money. But we might also think sometimes, maybe she'll actually use the money in a destructive way. But even if we don't, even if we think, the money really might contribute to her well-being, we still might think, after, a little more reflection, that the money was itself not so much an aspect of well-being. That's something that made possible her participation in various kinds of well-being. The other thing it's probably important to note there is that, again, this will be relevant to all of these, but we want to distinguish between what it is that I'm responding to and my response to it, right? So, I can say, in theory, I ought to notice when, let's say, friendship is happening, and I ought to appreciate friendship intellectually and emotionally. But I ought to be able at the same time to note that even if for one reason or another I can't do that, maybe I've got some pathology that gets in the way of my experiencing the goodness of friendship emotionally, or recognizing it intellectually, I might still want to say, it turns out that friendship still, on due reflection in my life or in somebody else's, does look like an aspect of well-being. So those are some things I'd want to note with respect to this first pathway. Dave, is there an issue you'd want to focus on there? Anything you want to say there before?
No, that's fine for me, except for the fifth one. You talk about an underlying deeper unity of these goods, and I wasn't quite following you there.
Okay, but I want to just work through in a little more detail these individual.
Oh, okay. The other one was, we can see when a creature is not flourishing.
Yeah. So that's again, if you say, things aren't going well for so-and-so here, again, you can ask, well, what is it? What aspect of that person's life is being impaired? And by focusing on that, again, we can, I think, get a clearer sense of things. And one thing that I find it illuminating to look at this approach that you talked about of asking successive questions. And I offered some examples here, which are I've sort of mimicked those offered by others, and whether my own examples are better or worse is an interesting question. But here are some of the examples that I offered in the book. Why do you want to go to Avery's house? In order to take a look at the painting she just got. Why do you want to take another look at the painting she just got? Because it's complex, evocative, and beautiful. So I want to have an aesthetic experience. Or why are you up so early? I want to read some more of that novel before I have to leave for work. Why do you want to read some more of that novel before you have to go to work? Well, because I'm worried about whether Doug the botanist will survive the masked ball. So I want to find out what happens to him. And this is a good, I often call imaginative immersion in a creative work. Why did you rub on that ointment? To reduce the discomfort I'm feeling after that scratch. When it gets freedom from physical pain. Why are you watching that video? So I can learn about late medieval usury laws. Why do you want to learn about late medieval usury laws? In order to understand the development of law and economics in Europe more completely. And here it's just a matter of knowledge and so forth. So again, the idea here is just trying to understand what it is to explain or justify behavior with an eye to the different elements, the different stages of reasoning that we might go through and making sense of that. The fourth point, Dave, you talked about flourishing cultures, and that certainly matters. We can take a little step back and think about flourishing cultures. What I had in mind, especially here, was just looking at which kinds of aspects of flourishing seem to be acknowledged or appreciated cross-culturally. And I think there is probably more of that than we sometimes think. It's been tempting probably to suppose that indeed cultural variation is so radical that we can't see these kinds of deep consonances that I think are sometimes there. So with respect to the fifth point, fifth kind of path toward understanding here, what I had in mind was the idea that what we're doing when we flourish is expressing our created capacities or our created potential. And so the idea here is that I arrive in the world with these capacities, with capacities for friendship, or with capacities for acquiring knowledge, or with capacities for appreciating the aesthetic qualities of some set of circumstances, or with the capacity for experiencing and developing harmony with reality in the widest sense. So all I'm trying to say here, and it sounds like what I said was more confusing than helpful in that discussion of that fifth point, but all I was trying to get at was the idea that if we think about what the kind of basic abilities or capacities or potentialities are that we have, then we might see a basic good or a basic aspect of well-being, as we might especially see it if we talk about flourishing, because that's really what I think flourishing is, in our general usage, as the development of those potentialities. And so if we can identify potentiality, then we can see flourishing as what it is to develop that particular potentiality. So I have the capacity to come to know things, flourish. I flourish when I acquire knowledge. Knowledge then is that aspect of flourishing that I'm interested in there.
Okay, so now we have a list of your 10 basic goods. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it's a representative list and represents your thinking about the matter. But quickly to recapitulate, we began with the definition of love as appropriate regard for the well-being of the beloved. Then we asked, what does it mean to have well-being in view? And we said, well, we can understand well-being if we identify the basic goods. Then we have talked about different ways of understanding the basic goods. And now we look at the 10 basic goods that you suggest. And here they are: aesthetic experience, avoidance of physical pain, harmony with reality in the widest sense, not wildest, widest sense.
You skipped friendship.
I did. Okay, so friendship should be here somewhere.
Aesthetic experience, avoidance of physical pain, friendship. I just alphabetized them. So friendship, harmony with reality in the widest sense, imaginative immersion, knowledge, life, play, practical wisdom, self-integration, sensory pleasure, and skillful performance.
Okay, that's the list. All right. Now, when I looked at that, it seemed to me that these were not very basic. Now, you have a whole section of your chapter talking about whether these are basic, but it's moving in a different direction. I wondered if, when you first started talking about basic goods, I thought about food and clothing and shelter and those kinds of things. And then I wondered, well, maybe we should talk about those as basic needs, as what's minimally required to exist. And then these are basic goods, what's required for flourishing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah. So let's say food, clothing, and shelter. Those are things that are instrumentally valuable as supportive of life and physical well-being. Most obviously, of course, also not just that. Clothing might also contribute to aesthetic experience. Food might contribute to sensory pleasure. I certainly hope it does. Shelter, again, might contribute to bodily well-being if it protects us from the elements. It might provide a space for friendship to happen. It certainly might be aesthetically appealing in one way or another, and so forth. So I think these things that you've mentioned are valuable precisely insofar as they're contributors to these various aspects of well-being. That's the way I would think of it.
Okay, so we don't eat food for the joy of eating food alone. We eat food as a way of helping us realize these other basic.
Yeah, now I do think sensory pleasure and the pleasure of consuming food on its own is perfectly reasonable, as a perfectly reasonable, thing to take into account. So not everybody does, but I'm not trying to dismiss that. But I would just say clearly we also eat because food contributes to life and bodily well-being and so forth. And so I think we can make the same kind of moves with regard to these.
And one would say the same thing about shelter. We can build things minimally to shelter us, but we can put our artistic energies into that, or dress or whatever. Okay, moving past that, then you talk about 7 circles of love, if I have these right.
So we do talk about that. Is it worth stopping to talk about qualitative differences and whether the goods are really basic?
If you brought it up, it means it is.
Well, it seems to me,
go for it.
It's fairly important for the way the arguments are gonna play out. I think later on, to kind of have this in mind as we think about the goods, right? So, as I said, I'm interested in distinguishing the kind of approach that I'd want to take from various other approaches. And so one of those approaches would be, I guess you'd broadly say, hedonism is probably a more limited kind of label for the kind of view I'm not interested in endorsing. But you're going to have views that say, well, the goods really are not basic. They're not basic because those goods themselves are really there because they serve some other end. So for a sort of classical hedonism like that of Jeremy Bentham, really, these are all just either means to or instances of some kind of consciously experienceable pleasure. And, you've also got, certain kinds of utilitarian approaches that would say, well, what we're really interested in is satisfying our preferences. And what matters is satisfying the preferences. And it's what I happen to prefer that matters. It's the satisfaction of those preferences that matters. And I'm trying to distinguish my view from those sorts of positions by saying, well, first of all, it doesn't really seem like that's the case if we just think about our own experience of the goods, of participating in these various aspects of well-being. I don't undertake a friendship in order to feel some sort of exhilaration. Now, maybe I do on occasion feel tremendous exhilaration at a shared experience with a friend, or at connecting with a friend, or at some other something related to the friendship. But I think I at least wouldn't be delighted to discover that if you wanted to be my friend, you wanted to be my friend because you thought the friendship would help to produce some kind of exhilaration in you. And I think the same thing is true in these other cases, that we value these things in our own experience on an ongoing basis because of what we take to be their own contributions to their constitutive relationship to our well-being, not somehow their ability to produce something else. And we're satisfied in them to the extent that we think about this reflectively because we take them to be worthwhile. It's not the case that they're worthwhile because we happen to be satisfied in them. And then the related point is they're all different. While they may be interestingly related in various ways, either necessarily or in a particular situation, still it seems to be the case that friendship is very different from knowledge, which is in turn very different from skillful performance, which is very different in turn from self-integration and so forth. And so I think these differences are qualitative, and because you can't, I think, turn the goods all into the aspects of well-being, all into instances of some one other thing like pleasure, then what you can't do, I think, is even get something like utilitarianism off the ground, because you can't talk about, as it were, maximizing the good in a given situation, because all the goods involved are heterogeneous. They're different in a deep way, and therefore, in any given situation, any given choice, we confront a range of very different options that we can certainly choose among non-arbitrarily. When we choose non-arbitrarily, we're not choosing in virtue of some attempt to generate the most possible good, because that just turns out to be nonsense given the heterogeneity, the qualitative differences among the various goods.
Well, if we take the issue of friendship as an illustration or as a case study, I think we can see the importance of this, because we've all been in relationships, I think, in which we thought the other person valued the friendship for the sake of the friendship and nothing more, only to discover that the friendship was a way for that person to get something he or she wants. And in that case, the friendship is not a genuine friendship. A friendship is genuine only if it's valuable for its own sake. Now, that doesn't mean you can't benefit from it, but the reason to have a friendship is not the anticipated benefit, but for the joy of having a friend, right?
Yeah, the friendship is itself the benefit. And
right.
And so, yeah, there may be other benefits that the friendship can in various ways produce. I mean, obviously, I might have a friend who helps me get a job, a friend who introduces me to my spouse to be, or whatever. I mean, all sorts of things we might imagine. It's not that there can't also be instrumental benefits, but to value something as a friendship, a relationship as a friendship, is to value it, first of all, for itself.
It's almost like saying, well, not to treat one's friend as a mere means, or means merely.
Yeah, friendship can't be a mere means, or it's not a friendship. Yeah.
And in that sense, all of these are basic because they are ends in and of themselves, and they are not identifiable with all the others. Now, do you want to say anything more about that?
Not now. I just wanted to
Okay.
make sure we didn't skip past that because I thought it was important for understanding what we're getting at here.
No, I think it is important. Now you talk about 7 circles of love, and these are what they are: universal love, mutual love with strangers, love of enemies, love for the vulnerable, love for those associated with particular causes and institutions, love as intimate connection, love as devotion. Now, I was interested that you did not arrange these in a series of concentric circles. This one, then this one, then this one, then this one. Rather, you seem to me, if I would visually portray it, would be one large circle, and within that large circle, there are a number of smaller ones, almost like wheels within a watch, but some of those circles overlap. And I'm wondering, would it have been possible to arrange these in a series of concentric circles?
Yeah, so I try to ground this, of course, in laying out the principles for specifying love that precede that model. And I want to say, by the way, also that I think talking in these terms reflects conversations that I think you and I have had for a long time. I think I remember some conversation, probably maybe even as far back as the Randall Visitor Center days of the earlier class that we both participated in when we talked about this matter. So thank you for continuing to be a source of stimulus here. I don't think, and again, I think, we do need to probably think about the various specifications of love to make sense of this, but I don't think you can treat them all as concentric in that way. I think devotion unavoidably has to be at the center, and I think universal love has to be all inclusive. But I think the others necessarily overlap because different relationships fall in different categories. It's not the case that someone will necessarily fall in one and only one of those categories. They're all categories that matter, and they've been central, I think, both to talk about Christian love and to the just human life generally. But we can't, I think, suppose that they are such that any one person will conveniently end up in only one box.
So that's helpful to me. Love as devotion is the core, and universal love is the circumference. But within that, there are these others that relate to each other in different ways. Now, we could talk about each one of these circles of love for a long time, but I'm going to move ahead a little bit and talk about specifications of love. And first of all, ask you why we need these specifications. That is, I take it a specification is a way of telling us what love usually looks like in ordinary life. And that my question is, why not leave that up to the Holy Spirit? Like say Quakers do. Quakers don't lay out what love needs to specifically look like. They rely on their intuition. They take it to be the Holy Spirit and would maybe look at this series of 5 specifications of love as being a little bit constraining or rigid or not sufficiently open to God's guidance. How would you respond to that?
Well, I guess I would say, I think we ought to specify, I think it makes sense to specify love in this way, in these 5 ways, because, when we actually examine the character and the dynamics of love, this is what we find, right? I mean, it's not a matter of sort of imposing arbitrary steel bands on love. It's a matter of thinking about what it is to love and working these out. And so I think and so maybe this is the really potentially controversial point. I think that there are sufficient commonalities in our lives, in our experiences, that we can indeed say love consistently can be specified in these ways. And maybe that's right, maybe it's not. At any rate, it's the central element of my attempt to reconcile an ethic of love with an ethic of natural law in the book. So it's certainly worth thinking about and talking about.
Okay, all of that was for me preparatory for what I put at the very end would be the specifications of love, and you have 5 of them, and I would like you to comment on each one of them in turn, but I would like to do that after the break so we don't feel quite so pushed. It's
Okay.
now 11:25. If we could reconvene at about 11:35 California time and then come back and deal with these 5 specifications of love. This is what love specifically looks like in everyday life. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, it's fine with me. For
Okay,
Gary, I guess that'd be okay. So
let's-
should we come back at 20 minutes to 12 or
11:35.
5 minutes
7:35? Okay,
or so.
Great. okay,
7:35, 7:37 in that range.
okay. We can do it.
Okay.
Okay,
Then we can move to this other topic without feeling so pressed for time.
okay. I'm going to
Okay.
pause the recording now.
Thank you, everybody, for coming back to the break in which we talk about these 5 specifications of love. And I invite as many of you as possible to take notes on this, because these 5 things, I think, are the most important part of the chapter, and we should focus on them quite specifically. I would like to introduce this part of our discussion by referring to an exchange that Peter Chimperu and I had a few weeks ago. I don't now recall what the overall conversation was, but along the way, Peter said, David, I want to ask you a question. And I want you to answer yes or no. Don't say anything else, just answer yes or no. And you emphasize that. Now, David, don't say anything other than yes or no. Do you remember that, Peter? Okay. Then I said, okay, what's the question? And you said, do you believe in situation ethics?
And you said no.
Pardon me?
You said no.
And I said, no. I did say, in addition, if by situation ethics you mean what Joseph Fletcher wrote in the book called Situation Ethics, my answer is no. And my no answer relates exactly to what Gary is doing here. And if I could summarize it, it would be this way. Joseph Fletcher pictures us going into a situation and asking us to do what the most loving thing to do is in that situation, with little or no guidance as to what love typically would require. Whereas, on the other hand, Gary is giving us 5 specifications of love that give us some preliminary inclination, some preliminary understanding of what love would require. And I think that's a big difference between moving into the situation with nothing but the word love, but moving into the situation with the word love, plus some specifications of what love ought to be. So with that in mind, I'd like to go over these 5 specifications, and I'll read through them once, and then I'll ask Gary to go back and comment on each of them, because as I've said, this is what I think is the most important part of the chapter. Number 1, love by choosing what matters. Recognition. Love consistently. The golden rule. Love by refusing to will injury. The Pauline principle. Love by being focused, by being determined, and diving deeply. Commitment, love by counting the cost. Efficiency. So those are the 5 specifications of love. They tell us what love looks like ordinarily in concrete circumstances. They're like the specifications of an automobile or of a computer or whatever. They tell us how this machine works. This will tell us how love works. So I'm going to ask Gary to go through these, and when he can, point out to some biblical resources that would help us to understand that these 5 specifications of love are not just pulled from the heavens indiscriminately, but they are rooted in the Christian heritage generally and in Scripture in particular. So here we have the first one: love by choosing what matters, and in parentheses, recognition. What about that, Gary?
Yeah, so I'm delighted to talk about that, but I want to just take a step back first and make a point that maybe really is more kind of inside baseball than is necessary, but that I think is significant here. A couple of different ways. So I think one way of thinking about specifications of love might be for somebody to say something like, well, these specifications provide a general sort of orientation, perhaps even as aspects of character. You might think about this as kind of narrowing the gap between this kind of approach and an ethics of character or virtue. And as a result, I come with these ways of looking at a situation, and I kind of know what to look at, what to look for, and so forth. Then ultimately, I have to, as it were, still finally make a choice. I want to be clear that that's not what I'm saying here, though I think there's something appealing about that. I don't think I can make a loving choice that's not a choice that embodies these specifications, right? So, and so I don't think that the various specifications are simply examples or instances or suggestions about how to think about love. Rather, if I'm not embodying these specifications in my choice, not necessarily consciously, but if it's not the case on due reflection that I'm embodying, then I'm not loving. Okay, so I want to be clear that I'm talking about these as really inescapable aspects of love. And I also want to stress the difference between saying what I'm trying to say here and what I think a certain kind of pragmatic or consequentialist approach might want to say, namely the pragmatic or consequentialist approach, which might well make sense for somebody in the role of an institutional decision maker who has to provide a kind of regular, predictable backdrop for other people's actions. That kind of person might just need to be consistent in part in recognition of the fact that the circumstances that give rise to the general principle might not apply in every given case, but we nonetheless ought to adhere to them in order to provide this kind of sensible, kind of predictable backdrop for action. But that's not, again, what I'm claiming here. I think that's not a reasonable way for individuals to choose. We ought to choose in light of factors that really are salient in the particular circumstance we're in. I just want to argue these specifications of love are always salient. Okay, so
they're stronger than presumptions. They're inescapable aspects.
Yeah.
Right. They don't merely set the general direction, they establish the necessary requisites of what a loving response would be. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So to say, first of all, we love by choosing what matters is not really to add anything to what I've already said earlier. It's just to kind of restate in a different way the point I've made about noting that these various aspects of well-being are various aspects of well-being. And that if we understand love as a matter of appropriate regard for well-being, then what we're doing is taking account of these aspects of well-being when we love. So I'm not kind of adding anything really to what I observed before, except in just reminding the reader that this idea of recognition, of recognizing what's valuable, means recognizing these aspects of well-being, and that these are the concerns we have when we seek to love.
Okay, what matters then are these aspects of life, well-being. So we choose by reference to these matters that are basically basic goods. I shouldn't say basically twice, but they are basic goods. Okay, number 2. Love consistently, the golden rule.
So the golden rule here is obviously especially important. It's been absolutely central to Christian moral reflection, and it's, of course, not only central to Christian moral reflection. And the idea here is simply to avoid arbitrariness, as John Finnis says very nicely, intelligence and reasonableness can find no basis in the mere fact that A is A and not B, that I am I and not you, for evaluating his, that is our, well-being differentially. And so we find this prescription on arbitrariness articulated at multiple points, of course, in the Bible. We find the two most basic expressions here. So in Leviticus 19:18, repeated in Matthew 22:39 and Mark 12:31 and 33, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then similarly, we find in Matthew 7:12, Luke 6:31, do to others as you would have them do to you. Sometimes people have tried to drive a wedge. Sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, just it sounded like someone's mic was on, perhaps was saying something. People have sometimes tried to drive a wedge between these two ways of talking, but I think these basically say the same thing. They're basically both about the moral equality and status of those who are in view, and so then we find these treated throughout as capturing the basic, many of the basic, probably use the word basic here too often, but capturing, many kind of general moral prescriptions. So in Matthew's gospel, we read, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets, speaking with respect to this, and love the Lord your God with all your heart. And then we find Paul saying the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then more elaborately in that passage that Dave read, the commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And the other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. So the idea here then is that this basic principle of fairness, of non-arbitrariness, of moral equality, captures much of what's absolutely important in our relationships with each other, and at the same time, of course, points us toward the recognition that so much of what goes wrong with our misbehavior in relation to others is a kind of arbitrary failure to acknowledge that basic moral equality.
Okay, number 3, love by refusing to will injury. Love by refusing to will injury, the Pauline principle.
Yeah, so the Pauline principle is, as Dave notes, a label that's been used by a variety of people here, it seems to me the current usage appears to have been introduced by Alan Donegan. but the idea here is don't purposefully injure. Don't injure for its own sake, if that's even really realistically conceivable, and certainly don't will injury as a means of bringing about some good, whether the good that you're trying to bring about is real or whether it's imagined, right? I mean, or just or indeed instrumental. It doesn't matter. Don't will as a means of bringing about some good. So it's called the Pauline principle here because of what we read in Romans 3:8. And why not say, as some people slander us by saying that we say, let us do evil so that good may come. And so the response is their condemnation is deserved, right? It's not the case that we can reasonably do that. And I suggest that it's not reasonable because of this recognition that the various aspects of well-being and their various kind of instantiation in the lives of particular people are different, right? And so the idea is that because life, let us say, is not somehow subordinate to aesthetic experience, I can't attack your life in the interests of aesthetic experience. I can't purposefully do that. It's not rational to do that. If I acknowledge that they're both good and I acknowledge that somehow aesthetic experience doesn't outrank life, then I don't have any justification for attacking life in the interest of aesthetic experience, and so forth. And so when we think about this, then when we recognize the heterogeneity, the fundamental heterogeneity of these various aspects of well-being, then what we have is a recognition that it doesn't make sense to attack, to treat as the object of one's action an attack on any aspect of well-being. Now, obviously, we live in a world in which all sorts of things happen, as it were, incidentally. Things happen that we don't intend. Things happen as, to use the traditional language, as side effects of what we do. And that may or may not be okay. Then there are separate constraints on whether, if injuries to various aspects of well-being happen, as it were, incidentally because of things that we do, that might or might not be reasonable. The particular constraint that's especially relevant here is the golden rule. It's often going to be inconsistent with the golden rule to bring about these injurious side effects, even when we're not purposefully attacking any aspect of well-being. But at minimum, we certainly don't want to, we have no justification for purposefully attacking. As St. Paul says, we ought not to do evil that good may come. We ought not, I think, and I want to read that, is we ought not to cause injury to bring about good, purposefully.
This is very important because refusing to will injury, purposefully to cause injury, intentionally to cause injury, is very important in medical ethics. And then the distinction between outcomes which are foreseen but not intended, and those that are intended and foreseen, is a very, very important distinction in medical ethics to be discussed on another occasion. Number 4, love by being focused, by being determined, and diving deep. And in parentheses here, we have commitment.
Yeah. I probably should have said diving deeply, but anyway. No, I didn't. You correctly reproduced what I said. So here, this is a notion that I think doesn't get enough attention in ethics, and it's a notion that because it doesn't get as much attention as some other themes, maybe deserves a little more attention here. I wrote a whole book just about this topic. The idea here, and there's a footnote I see here to that for those who have the PDF. So the idea here is that we don't really manage to plumb the depths of any of the various aspects of well-being if we are superficial about it. And So I always start here, for instance, with the example of Jacob commits himself to engaging in 14 years of work for Laban in order to marry Rachel. So he makes an agreement with Laban. That's true. But separately, he needs to be sufficiently determined and self-invested in order to keep working for Laban so that he'll receive Laban's approval for his marriage. Similarly, Ruth resolves that she will accompany Naomi to her ancestral home. Despite their likely appeal, Daniel determines not to defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. In Isaiah, the servant of the Lord declares, I have set my face like flint, determining to move forward despite adversity and inner resistance. And Luke tells us, perhaps echoing Isaiah 50, that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. The idea here is that we accomplish things by determining that we're going to pursue goals in the face of adversity, where adversity isn't necessarily just external adversity, but often it's our own internal resistance. The idea that the temptation to just give up because it takes more emotional energy to keep focused, and we're interested in other things and so forth. And so my suggestion here is that, first of all, again, if we want to dive deep, if we want to really plumb the depths of particular goods, we need to dive deep. And we need to do that, there has to be sufficient self-investment to see what's there. Now, sometimes we might obviously say, for instance, invest ourselves in particular ways and discover this doesn't work. It's not the case that we necessarily have to commit ourselves to doing, anything and everything come hell and high water. It would be very foolish of me to commit myself to becoming a professional basketball player. They're just kind of physical incapacities that would get in the way there. On the other hand, with regard to marriages and friendships, we may make promises with respect to these relationships that help to ground them, but we also, I think, make commitments on our own, separate from those promises, that we're going to invest deeply in them. And doing so, keeping those, seems especially important, because if we don't do so, we're not going to be able to either experience the goods they offer or offer particular goods to those with whom we're committed. Similarly, making commitments like this enables us to make plans, make long-term plans. It helps us to therefore determine the ordering, the ranking, and so forth that we'll give to particular aspects of well-being, to particular goods in our lives. You can't just kind of willy-nilly stumble around in relation to these. Instead, we have to make plans on occasion, and to do that, we have to have established priorities, established goals, and then thus again making commitments enables us to do that. So Finnis here, writing in Fundamentals of Ethics, if we've decided to build a highway through the desert, we can use cost-benefit computations to select among materials and methods of leveling and road building. But it was not, and could not rationally have been, cost-benefit computations which guided our prior commitment to the level of economic activity, trade, and personal mobility, which calls for highways of this sort. We know that the building and use of highways of this sort involves the death of tens of thousands of persons and the horrible injury of hundreds of thousands more each year. We've not made any computation which shows that the goods participated in and attained by that level of trade mobility exceed, outweigh, or proportionally greater than the goods destroyed and damaged by that level, or any level of deaths and injuries. Nor, on the other hand, could any computation yield the conclusion that the deaths and injuries are an evil which objectively outweighs, exceeds, etc., the goods of mobility, etc. The justification, and equally the critique, of any basic commitment, in light of which a choice like this might be assessed, must be in terms of the requirements of practical reasonableness, which give positive direction, even though they do not include any principle of optimizing, and even though they permit indefinitely many different commitments, as well as also excluding indefinitely many other possible commitments. So we need this way of establishing priorities to make these decisions. In addition, Commitment matters because I have good reason to develop the habit of commitment keeping, since I can achieve any goal more effectively this way. Every time I keep one commitment, I make it more likely that I'm going to succeed in keeping others. I will keep myself from acting on impulse, which can lead me in less than desirable directions, and so forth. Also, when I'm good at adhering to my plans, other people know they can rely on me and cooperate with me. I make it more likely to adhere to the publicly visible commitments if I also adhere sincerely to the less visible ones, and so forth. So I note a number of things like this. Keeping commitments helps to ensure that I've got a coherent identity, that my life hangs together over time. But by contrast, I rupture myself if I disregard my commitments. And so, there are other factors we might note here. The important point is, the reason I'm noting all of these things is that very often, I think we'll find ourselves saying things like, talking about these matters in such a way that we're saying, well, I've made a decision, I've made a plan, even sometimes I've made a promise to myself. But obviously, if I make a promise to you, you can perfectly well release me from that at your discretion. If I make a plan, it might just seem like, well, I can change my plans. The important thing about commitments is that we have reason to not simply release ourselves from them and not simply, change them at will. Obviously, there are going to be various reasons we might do that. And I wrote a book about this, so there's a lot more detail we might talk about here. But I think it's just important to recognize that committing ourselves, investing ourselves, is a way of flourishing, because it enables us to love both ourselves and others more deeply and richly.
Okay, thank you. Number 5 of the inescapable aspects of love would be love by counting the cost, efficiency.
Yeah, so Paul Ramsey was very fond of quoting this passage from Luke 14. For which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, "This fellow began to build and was not able to finish." Or what king going out to wage war against another king will not sit down first and consider whether he's able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the term of peace. So the point here is that when we make decisions, we need to be aware of good and bad outcomes that might flow from a given choice, and also be aware of the commitments and therefore the goals and priorities and so forth that we have embraced, in virtue of which we can make good judgments about those costs and benefits. Again, there's not a kind of objective global cost benefit calculation you can make. I think Finis is exactly right about that. But within the terms set by the priorities that we've established, we certainly can make them, and we need to do so. Reasonably. We need to be fully aware of what the consequences are and how to take those into account in light of our various the various constraints that are inherent to love, as well as the ones we've further embraced via commitment.
Okay, quickly by way of review, these are the 5 inescapable aspects of love. Love by choosing what matters, love consistently, love by refusing to will injury, love by being focused, by being determined, and by diving deeply, and love by counting the cost. So with that, over to you, Forrest.
Okay, all right. I have got Anastasia. Did you want to ask a question too? I think you did. I'm going to put you down the list. Okay, Simona. Simona, we're coming to you.
Thank you. This was, as always, very interesting. Just a couple of brief observations. Maybe I have missed it, but I did not see any talk about loving by acceptance. I think this is a very important aspect of love, that you love somebody the way they are, accepting them as they are, instead of trying to change them, which is, I think, quite common. And so I think that psychologically speaking, every human being at least has this need to be accepted, to be loved as they are. So that's just first thing I wanted to say. The second, I think this last item that you were talking, love by counting the cost. Isn't love supposed to be regardless of the cost? I mean, we may be aware of the cost, but if you truly love something or someone, then you love regardless what that cost may be. Second, and then third one, when you were talking about potential development of potentials, what about using potentials? Providing the space, environment, to use the potentials that people have, that so not just allow them to develop, but also to be able to use it. And I'm specifically thinking about now on a level of society, where frankly I don't think we have any society in the world that is fully giving women the ability to use the potentials that they have as human beings. So this inequality that we have, whether it's as a matter of, male, female, or races, based on the race, based on, many other things, that there are always going to be groups in society that are not allowed to flourish. Because those who are holding the power are afraid of losing that power if they allow that other group to flourish and fully develop their potential and use it. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you as always for being a very reflective and thoughtful interlocutor. So let me try to address the three things that you mentioned. Number one, loving by acceptance, I think is hugely important. I think that in any relationship in which we know ourselves to be exposed to others, it is really crucial that we know that we can be embraced, that we can be accepted despite the undoubted, let's just say in the most general sense, problems and flaws that we present. I think I agree 100% that that's important. I think that that shows up in a variety of contexts, and I think is something that flows from the various specifications of love that I've mentioned. So I didn't list it separately, but that's not because I don't think that it doesn't flow from those. I think that it's a crucial part of the golden rule, and it's a crucial aspect of commitment. It's also probably important in some ways with regard to recognition, insofar as recognition involves and certainly to come to something you raised here, counting the cost. I think just being aware of the actual consequences of what we do. So 3 cheers, I agree 100% in favor of love as acceptance. As regards counting the cost, I agree 100% that when I love, that I don't get to be exempt from the various specifications of love on the basis of counting some cost to myself. I think that's absolutely right. I don't get to say I can stop being devoted to a partner or a friend because that's too costly. I also think, however, that when I'm determining what my actions are going to be in fulfillment of any of the various specifications of love and in relation to people in any of those various circles, I need to be aware of what the consequences are. Again, because I reject any kind of utilitarian or consequentialist approach to ethics, I don't think you can kind of add up all the goods in a situation and decide what to do based on that. And so count, as it were, costs and benefits and weigh the benefits against the cost just as such and choose on the basis of some calculation there. I don't think you can do that. But when you're choosing in a given case and within the terms set by the prior promises and commitments and so forth that you've made, then it certainly matters that you be aware of what the consequences are. It would be irresponsible, it seems to me, to say, for instance, I really want to be helpful to my friend who's wrestling with alcohol addiction. And I think the best way to do that is to take that person from bar to bar and really help him to fight back against the temptation to buy another drink. I think it seems to me I'm just not being properly sensitive to what's almost certainly going to be the consequence of doing that. In the case of somebody wrestling with that kind of addiction. So it just feels to me as if consequences here matter, not because they determine whether or not we're going to love, but because they determine how in a given case love comes to expression. And then finally, with regard to developing potentials, yes, of course, there are factors that often institutional factors, cultural factors, and so forth that inhibit the expression of people's potentials. And I don't doubt for a moment that comes to expression notably in the kind of sexism that you've mentioned, and that we are all of us deprived of opportunities that would be available if the full potential of the women in our various societies was given opportunity for expression. I think that's a matter, seems to me, of the golden rule. It's a matter of avoiding the kind of arbitrariness that is so characteristically at the root of this kind of subordination. And of course, unavoidably, then that means diving into the conversation about the sorts of rationales that might be offered for that kind of subordination and exploring why in given cases they are, as it seems to me, likely to be arbitrary and therefore impermissible in terms of the golden rule. So there's certainly more to be said there, but I think absolutely that to be aware of to take the golden rule seriously is certainly to not be supportive of for multiple reasons of institutional practices and so forth that preclude the expression of people's potentials. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to go to Peter now. Peter?
Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. I'd like to make a short comment in regard to my discussion with David a few Sabbaths ago about situational ethics. David said no, and today he expounded a little bit about that. In my view, there is situational ethics. And I will limit myself to an example. The commandment said you should not kill. But let's say if two people go in the forest and accidentally one is hitting another and killing him, well, according to Lex Talionis, he should be stoned. But there is a provision there that he can go to a city of refuge and he can avoid being killed. This is a situational ethics in my view. And now I have a few questions, comments about Gary's presentation. I'll limit myself to two if I may. And then if there is more time, I will add some others, a few others. Immanuel Kant believed that the morality is innate. that we have innate morality. And in light of his belief, he asked the question, should we judge the Bible in light of this innate morality or morality in light of the Bible? And that is the first question. The second question is, should we include in the hierarchy of Maslow morality? Is there a place for it in Maslow's hierarchy of basic good or necessary goods, needs?
Yeah. So just a couple of brief observations here. I think that I don't think that I guess it would be worth defining more maybe what somebody means when talking about situation ethics. But when I hear the language of situation ethics, I hear one of two possible views. One of those is the view that we ought to be, and this is, I think, the view that Joe Fletcher actually takes in his book, Situation Ethics. We ought to make decisions. We ought to make each decision on the basis of our answer to the question, what in this decision, which option open to me in this situation will be the most loving, by which he means will yield the most good. Okay. And so if that's what you mean, then I suggest, as I've said before, the notion of the most good is just a mistaken notion. It's just a notion like, the happiest rock. It's a nonsense notion. If by contrast, here's another thing that you might mean. The other thing that I think people often mean in talking about situation ethics, they mean something called moral particularism. And so here the idea is not that there is a single principle of the kind that Fletcher had in mind. Rather, there are no principles, but what you see are simply the relevance that particular reasons that each particular reason in a given situation turns out to have in that situation. You're supposed to be able to somehow discern that. So each situation has its own unique kind of configuration of relevant reasons in a particular way. These are the particular reasons can be relevant in a particular way. And you ought to decide in light of those. And again, I think, in fact, that doesn't seem right. I think that some reasons are relevant in fairly consistent ways. And that's why I talk about them as specifications of love. That doesn't mean, I think, that you can't have some kind of arrangement like the cities of refuge. So two comments about that. First of all, of course, I think it's generally agreed that the language in the original, in fact, is don't murder rather than don't kill. But even if you take it to be don't kill, it doesn't follow from the fact that the language is don't kill that you couldn't have some kind of arrangement and suppose that was an exceptionless moral rule. So I take it to be, I take the principle don't kill purposefully as an absolutely exceptionless moral rule. I don't think you can ever rightly kill purposefully, but it doesn't follow from that any particular thing ought to happen to somebody who does in fact kill, whether accidentally or purposefully. And the provision of something like the cities of refuge to protect somebody against blood vengeance isn't, I think, in any way inconsistent with judging the action of killing either purposefully or kind of negligently to be you can judge that to be completely unacceptable, and at the same time I think that the cities of refuge are helpful. And so I don't think there's an inconsistency there. I would just say with regard to Kant, right? So Kant famously
Just a
said,
sec. I'm sorry, Gary, for
Sure.
interrupting you.
yeah,
Then simply put, don't you think that every action that we take should be judged to the prism of intention? Simply put.
well, but not just intention, Peter, because I think we can intend reasonably and intend unreasonably. We can intend in a way that's arbitrary, or we can intend in a way that's not arbitrary. So I think intention matters, but I don't think the intention is ever the only thing that matters. Yeah, I mean, it's if I intend, yeah. So all I was suggesting, we could take intention to be relevant. We could take other things to be relevant in the case of the accidental killing. But what happens next doesn't, as far as I can see, follow in any particular way from the judgment that the accidental killing was, say, negligent and therefore unfair, inconsistent with the golden rule, wrong. So with regard to, let's say, here's Kant. Kant famously says that, look, to recognize, as he says, the Holy One of the Gospels, as the Holy One of the Gospels, to recognize Jesus as a moral exemplar, we have to start out, we come to that experience of reading the stories in the Gospels with existing moral knowledge, with existing moral judgment. And it's not the case, therefore, I think, that we might not find ourselves in a particular case confronting a discovery, in a story in the Gospels, let's say, and I think the obvious example here is the various issues related to love for enemies that might really prompt us to rethink how we understand the implications of our principles, of our specifications of love, and so forth. But on the other hand, there's no way we can avoid arriving at something like say any story in the Gospels with prior moral judgments. I don't think there's a kind of a way to avoid that, just given that we are what we are. I don't think Kant's necessarily right that those are largely a priori. Maybe some of them are taught, and because they're taught, they can be in one way or another adjusted. But whenever I come to any experience, I come with a background, and I think our moral judgments are among those. I think choosing well morally is absolutely an aspect of well-being. So I'm not terribly interested in framing my approach in reference to Maslow's approach, but choosing well, or what I would call practical wisdom, is exactly one of the basic aspects of well-being. And so somebody who chooses well, who chooses in a morally good manner, is precisely flourishing as that person chooses. It's not that that's a separate kind of consequence of that or independent reality, but one of the ways in which we flourish is by choosing well, and one of the ways in which we choose wisely is by choosing morally, it seems to be.
All right, thank you. Anastasia? Unmute yourself, Anastasia. There you go.
Am I? Okay.
You're okay now.
Thank you. What a point to continue. Thank you. Where is Dr. Chartier? I cannot see him.
Well,
yes.
there he is. There he is.
Thank you so much. What a great privilege to have you here and on those topics. And thank you, Dr. Larson. And this class definitely is one of those that do honor, at least I do, philosophers. And thank you, Dr. Larson, for giving us the opportunity. And I'm so visual, unless I see, I still don't see Dr. Chartier on the screen. But
yeah, he's there. He's there.
Okay, I'm so visual unless I see somebody.
Can you see him now?
But I take it by faith. I still don't see him, but that's okay. I think I will be able to hear him.
I'm waving at you on a
Yes, now I see you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much. I feel Socrates is speaking and many other philosophers. And I want to say, I'll come back to this F, the best. What you ended with exactly what was Socrates' point about his two most famous mottos, "Utos zin peripi theon estibato efzin." Is not, the question is not to live, but how can we live the best? And he uses the word in the superlative of the good. And then underneath that good, we have all those others. So many times what is like agape is not what is not, or what it is. And the umbrella is to kalon, what is beautiful, what is virtuous, what is good, and so on and so forth. But I was going to start about, because I'm also my almost doctorate, I missed the 1/3 of the doctorate because of a tragedy in my family, is in comparative literature, classics, French and English, and existentialism, Christianity, and so on. So the fathers of the Nicene fathers did take some of those concepts, and they say they used it as a slave, as a servant to Christianity, not to replace Christianity. Yes. So going back to the preach of some of what you said about also the balance between the capital T truths, those that are unchangeable, and those things that are in flux. And Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosophers and scientists, and Heraclitus specifically, noticed that the world was in flux and chaos, but according to him and the pre-Socratic philosophers, they accepted an overall intelligence that was constant, and that was good. But anyway, and so that I appreciate your balance between what is flexible and what is just changing, and those things that do not change. Now, when it comes to the word agape, in the little book of Plato wrote about Socrates' apology, and his whole life of Socrates is actually, that's why they put him to death, because he did attack those concepts of what is good, what is virtuous, what is beautiful, of the Greek mythology of the time. And so his two mottos were not to live, but what is best. And so they went through that. What is best? I'm summarizing best, and something that was very controversial and very new was that what we thought or what we think it's selfish, that means it serves self. Through his discussions, tried to prove that actually it's against self. It's what you said about the morality, what we call nature law, etc., because actually we don't know it, or we do know it. If we do those things that are not beautiful, etc., we harm ourselves. And again, I think that's what you also tried to do. I'm so excited. I see that, and you made it even more plain that we can understand it. And so I understood when Christ said, "Forgive them; they don't know what they're doing." He believed that, in the true sense of will, most of the people don't know that is the bad thing for them to do. When they think that they are selfish and please themselves at many points, they're actually hurting themselves. And the other thing is it cannot be it cannot be the best way of living without doing the best for your fellow men, for your city, for your people. And I think a lot of that comes through you. The one thing that also the measure, one thing we see from what I have read from Homer to Socrates or so on, you're right, the word agape doesn't come, but we do so much, but we do know what agape is not. Agape is not just eros in the classical thing. Agape is not philia. Philia is better than eros. And we do see, especially in the times of the church fathers, the word agape, which is the unselfish love. It's not the love that is guided by just emotions or desire, epithemia, or all this. And then it's a lot more, but I'm not going to say it now. And then when we come to the New Testament, we have at least 2 points at least 2, more than 2, that describe God besides his actions as a statement. Is it in John when it says, Agape esti o Theos, God is agape. He's not philos, he's not eros, he's not epithemia, but it's agape, which is that, what you said, the unconditional, but also the steadfast. It's not the changing. And the other thing, also in the New Testament, when Christ orders, it's an order to love one another. He said, agapate allelus. And we see many other places, there is a big difference between agape and eros and philia. Agape has philia, it could have or not have it. And there are many other examples. And also we know about that the egoism, the egotism that Socrates talked, the hubris examples that Homer said, that they're self-destructive. These are what agape is not. And their Olympian gods were not attributed to having agape. We have the difference between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Apollonian is getting closer to agape, but we don't. So at least my humble opinion as a comparative literature person and classics is that agape still stands for what we believe as being the unconditional perfect love. And as you said, how you ended when Socrates says the best that we can do. So what you said is not all or nothing. We should choose as much as possibly the best, because that's not only the best for the society, for everybody, but for us. And I want to thank you very, very much for all of this. I should have a question there, but I don't. I'm sorry. But I'm looking forward to hear your comments, and thank you.
Anastasia, you are always very gracious and perhaps humblingly so in the way you engage with me. So thank you for that. Since it's 12:30, let me try and be briefer than I might otherwise be. Let me just comment on two fronts. First of all, thank you for zeroing in on the point about truth. I think that really does matter a great deal. One way to think about truth with a capital T is that truth with a capital T is what God knows. And that's, there's always going to be unavoidably a gap between the infinite truth in the mind of God and any knowledge that I might have or you might have. And that's so it's important to hang on to the idea that there really is truth, even as at the same time we recognize that there's always a gap between what is really the case and what we ourselves with minds that are finite, fallible, and sinful understand. So I think that gap is really important. The other thing I want to say is I'm very glad that you picked up on the point that we get in Socrates, but not only in Socrates, and in really all of the, I think, really influential classical authors, up and then in the early Christian writers up through, probably maybe as late as the 14th or 15th centuries. And that's the idea that there's there's not a kind of inherent conflict between self and other in ethics. That I think in the so-called modern period, say beginning in the 17th century or so, we definitely get this idea that ethics is about adjudicating conflicts among kind of basically opposed and isolated persons. And I think it's just not right on a whole host of levels, and that instead we can see a range of ways in which our various goods intersect with each other. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we don't sometimes can't sometimes make bad choices that turn out to be profoundly harmful to others, just as we sometimes make choices that are profoundly harmful to ourselves. But that we think about what's good, we think about flourishing, we can recognize various both constitutive on the one hand and instrumental on the other connections among our well-being and the well-being of others, rather than seeing these as inherently at odds. And while that's not a central theme in this book, it is a note that I sound because I think it is very important. It was not the case for most of Christian history that this modern view was the widely embraced one among Christian theologians and philosophers. And it certainly, as you rightly note, Anastasia, was not there in the classical period. And I think it's valuable that a number of people have been trying increasingly to recapture this notion in the present.
Thank
Anyway.
you so very much. I can't wait to read your books. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, David, I'm going to turn it over to you before we go to our post potluck here. So David, to you. And thank you, Gary, again for being here.
Of course.
Okay, thank you again to Gary. Thank you to everybody. A couple of comments. Next week, we are going to study the Adult Sabbath School Quarterly. How
Wow.
about that? We're going to take the whole quarter in one Sabbath. So get the quarterly, read it from top to bottom, left to right. One of the problems the quarterly has is that it deals with a topic 1/13 at a time. And that is a real frustration for the authors and for the readers. Let's take a look at the whole quarterly as though we were reading a single book and discuss the whole of it next Sabbath, okay? And as many people who can read the quarterly before that, the better. As many people who know something about the Bible who are here, the better. It's on the resurrection and the nature of humankind, which also has much philosophical significance and much ethical, even bioethical import. So next week, we're going to do something revolutionary. We're going to study the adult lesson for the fourth quarter. You can pick up the quarterly by Googling or otherwise, fourth quarter Sabbath School lessons. And you can download it, I think, from Kindle. I'm not sure what the other thing was. So here we go. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Okay. I'm stopping recording now. And then I'm going to